All right. Well, welcome and good morning to the inaugural Startup Streamlined with us here at Thompson Hine. My name is Lindsay Karras-Stencil, and I am a partner in our New Ventures practice group. And joining me today is Francesca Guerrero, a partner in Thompson Hine's International Trade practice group. And so today we're going to discuss some unique rules that companies must anticipate and follow involving foreign direct investment, including CFIUS. And so we're going to address what is CFIUS and its impact on a startup, the basic things that startups need to consider, and some of the common missteps that we see our startup clients and other folks may make if they don't realize that this is something that's important to them. Naturally, if you have any questions or comments, we love those. So make sure that you drop those in the Q&A box and we'll address those. We left some time for Q&A at the end. And we'll do our best to get to those at the end, like I said. So with that, let's get started. Francesca, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Yeah, Lindsay, thank you for inviting me. We've talked about it a lot. It's nice to talk in front of other people.
Right. So Francesca sits in our DC office. She is incredibly versed and familiar with international trade, international import-export rules. And so I think a lot of people just get really intimidated by this topic. And so why don't you start us off and just tell us like, hey, what is CFIUS? What are some of the things that we need to think about? And what do you often see that impacting startups?
Sure. I mean, I kind of like to start with how it, sorry guys, turn off my phones. So I like to sort of start with how it originated, and it was, passed decades ago, the original laws, because the government, the US government, was concerned about foreign persons coming in and taking over US businesses that had strategic importance to our defense and national security. And what's happened over the years is our understanding of what's strategic to national security has changed. And there was a concern that developed of not just foreign capital, foreign persons taking over a business, but investing in a business and gaining access to sensitive technology, sensitive data that might be used for nefarious purposes. And so the process, the CFIUS process was created. CFIUS stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, to sort of monitor and frankly block things that the US government thinks would be a problem for our national security. That's it in a nutshell. I won't go into the weeds until you ask me the next question.
Okay, no problem. So I would say, it's interesting because, you and I get the chance to interact quite often, not just because our startup clients are expanding and seeking out international investors or maybe have sensitive technology, but we see the world is getting smaller and we see lots of investors coming in. And so what are the basics that startups really need to consider when they're thinking about that, taking on that foreign capital? And what are the most common places that you see where we need to get ahead of that sooner rather than later?
I think there's maybe two things I'll focus on. One is, I think companies should spend some time understanding whether they really have a sensitive business, whether what they're doing is either like a new technology that might be, like computer related, software related, spatial software, AI, who knows? These are all emerging things, but something that might be sensitive to the US government, or whether they're gathering a lot of data on individuals, people who have apps might be collecting data on thousands, millions of people and not realize that data itself is considered sensitive to the government. They might have a critical role in a supply chain. And so I think that companies should spend some time thinking about their own business profile. So they actually have a sense as to whether they might trigger concerns. And then the second thing I think companies sometimes don't realize is that CFIUS can apply in two circumstances. One is any acquisition of control, so any sort of controlling investment, which is very broadly defined, but also when they have a minority investment in certain types of businesses. And so a lot of times, if you're talking about foreign capital in a startup, you're not talking about the type of investor that's like a money market or something that's just like investing to get like steady returns. You're talking about someone who's making a strategic investment, and strategic investors usually want more access and involvement in the company, and that's like totally normal. But when they have those rights, when they have that type of investment, that might mean that CFIUS can review it. So when you're looking at strategic investors, that often can fall under CFIUS review.
So what happens then if a startup is taking on maybe institutional venture funding, and that venture fund either has a strong coalition of foreign investors or is controlled by a foreign investor? How do you look at that then?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it raises a good point. It's the ultimate ownership that's relevant. It's not like where the company that's investing in your business is formed. So you can have a Delaware company. But if it's owned by foreign persons, then that's what's important. And so sometimes we do have to really look through and scrutinize the investor to see where they're from, what kind of background they have, whether they have gotten on the wrong side of the US government in the past, whether they're from a country that we don't, consider an ally, things like that.
Interesting. So I guess that then takes us to, what are some of the most common missteps you see? And if you have any war stories without revealing client confidences that you could provide us, that would be great.
Yeah, no, okay, so here's a pretty common one. This is when companies, let's say they're an intermediary manufacturer. They manufacture some special thing, pipe, form, who knows what it is, but they manufacture something to the design of their customer. So the customer is like giving them specifications. Sometimes I've seen companies take on a project for a defense contractor, and they don't realize that their product that they're making is ITAR control. That's a defense export regulation. And because of that, now their business is what's called a TID US business. It's a designated sensitive business. So even though 98% of what they do is not sensitive, it's not export related, that one little part is. And it's sort of, characterized the whole business now as sensitive. And so they take on a foreign investor without even realizing that they had to do a filing. Like I should mention, there's some mandatory filings. Often CFIUS is sort of a voluntary process that parties go through because they want a safe harbor. So if you submit your transaction for review, the government clears it. They can't unwind it later. But if you don't submit your transaction for review, the government can come in indefinitely and unwind it, like order someone to divest their shares, order a business sold, things like that. So I should mention that at the beginning. That's the sword. And then in a few circumstances, there are mandatory filings, and if you don't make those, there are penalties. So I think to your question, what's a common misstep is companies don't realize that it's not really whether their business as a whole is sensitive, but whether any little part of their business is sensitive. And that might trigger a mandatory filing.
Sure.
Or just CFIUS, concern.
Interesting. So what are we talking when we say penalties? What does that look like? Because some people are like, whatever, I'll deal with it. But if it's incredibly punitive, they should know about it.
It is incredibly punitive in theory. We haven't seen too many examples of it used yet because it's only a few years old, but it's up to the value of the transaction.
Oh.
So Yeah, that's the potential penalty.
Interesting. And so you talked about being able to unwind the transaction indefinitely. And
Mhm.
so I know there's been some war and horror stories that have happened. So can you share just magnitude of, government kind of sweeping in and getting involved? And what has that looked like?
Sure. And interestingly, a lot of the ones where the government has gotten involved lately involve like software and data. So like
Mm,
TikTok has been on the news on and off because of the ByteDance, acquisition several years ago, which was, I believe, not reviewed by CFIUS. And several years later, they said, we want you to submit a filing. They reviewed it. There was an order of divestiture, but I think because it's so big, it's like being negotiated at the highest levels of government. There's an
sure.
issue. And another circumstance I'm aware of, like a software program for sharing data about personal health issues, like allowing people to communicate about like whatever condition they have with other people, was not submitted to CFIUS, and they reviewed it a couple years later and ordered it divested by the Chinese company that acquired it. There's another case I was just reading about, where a Chinese investor invested in a company that has like air aviation type technology,
Mm,
and they didn't completely acquire it, but even even their minority investment is coming under scrutiny now because the
yeah.
government is concerned that um, they were using it as an opportunity to like basically kind of take technology,
Mm,
like sensitive technology, out of the country.
sure. So startups are often pretty cost conscious. And, I think I can see some of them saying, well, it's a voluntary filing. So do I have to do it or not do it? I mean, how do you coach startups through that, or anyone through that, and explain to them the cost and the risk?
Sure. So we always like to talk to companies and kind of do a risk assessment. It can be like informal, it can be formal. And you look at the questions of like, really, what are the vulnerabilities that the business has? Like, the startup poses, what sort of data do they have? What sort of technology? Um, then we look at the threat of the investor, and we look at like, um, again, are they from an allied country, or are they from a company that has a bad track record? Um, and we put those together to do a risk assessment and see whether CFIUS we think really would be interested, like moderate, high. That's sort of one of the important things for companies to think about when they consider whether to do a filing.
Mhm.
Another thing that they can do if they're cost conscious about the filings is they can always try to structure the investment in a way that's passive and that it's outside of CFIUS review. So I know the strategic investors always want to have like a board seat or something.
Mhm.
But you can say, well, look, we're a TID-US business. If you really want a board seat, um, you have to pay all the fees for filing and legal fees.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen, by the way. Um, or you can have a passive investment.
Okay. Super, super interesting. So you've mentioned a couple times allied countries. And so naturally, we have a pretty unfortunate situation unfolding on the other side of the earth today, today, and has been for the past several weeks, between Russia and Ukraine. And so when we think about CFIUS and imports and exports, how is this Russian situation impacting businesses and startups today?
Well, I do think that startups should be especially sensitive about existing and new investment from Russia because there are new controls in place that, like in the last couple of weeks,
Mm,
restrict what sort of technology Russian persons can have access to. And actually, even, like I said, pre-existing investment it's worth taking a minute to scrutinize whether the new rules impact how you can relate to your current shareholders. Whether you can share the same information with them that you might have before. There are some big changes. Otherwise, to be honest, I'm not sure how much investment is coming out of Russia, just from a practical point of view right now.
Well, yeah, when they can't access their money, that becomes a little bit more challenging, sure. So what about the startups who maybe have developers that have been working with them for an extended period of time, but just so happen to be located in Russia right now? How should we be thinking about that?
There are a lot of software developers in Russia and
Yes.
And in the Ukraine as well.
Yes.
And it's definitely, again, worth looking at, taking a close look at whether you're sharing technology that's now restricted, because there's now a wide swath of technology that's restricted. So some of the software developers may not be able to continue working on some of the programs they were working on.
Oh my goodness. So what do you recommend to startups? This is not legal advice. This is general discussion. But, are we thinking, hey, we've got to look at the technology and make a strong suggestion to just stop working with them marching forward? But then how do we protect any information that they've already worked on? How are we thinking about that?
I think protecting the information they've already worked on is hasn't really changed so much. It's the same sort of considerations around trade secrets, IP, and issues that you should already be thinking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe next coffee chat. um, but I think in terms of what they should do is they need to look at they need to take a step back and look at what they're actually making and determine whether it's export controlled.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of companies haven't done that because they're not actually exporting it yet, or they don't realize they are, and so they haven't done that analysis. Sometimes it's usually the kind of thing where you do need outside help, to be honest, legal,
Sure.
maybe consultants.
Yeah, I know. And lots of startups, cash is king or queen, however you want to talk about that, right? So that's a big decision that they've got to make. So I guess one of the last questions that I would have then is, how do you have a checklist when you work with someone? Do you have a checklist that you just work through to figure out, like, hey, is this export controlled? And even if you're not exporting, here's what you got to do. How do you talk a client through that?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I keep saying that because you have so many great questions, Lindsay.
Oh, I'm on fire today. It's all that caffeine.
Yeah, and we did talk about maybe trying to put together a communal.
Did.
Yeah, so we can circle up on that. But first, I think you need to think about, again, what it is you're making and just understand your product. And that's not new to you. There's lots of regulations. Export's not the only one where you have to think about, like, do I really understand my product? And then to determine if it's export controlled, the first step is really just looking at this list of export controlled items. And if you're not on it, then you're lucky. But it's a process of elimination.
Sure.
The second thing I think that I tell startups is really to think about your customers and third parties, like your foreign developers. Are they restricted? And so that can involve punching their name into some screening programs or websites to see, is this person a restricted end user? And I think honestly those those are the two most essential steps. We also usually encourage companies to have a basic policy to help spread awareness in their company. I mean, you might have a company with 5 people, right? But everyone needs to just kind of have some awareness that this can be an issue. You might have a company with 200 people, it depends on the size.
Sure.
And just be sensitive to, oh, we're sharing something outside of our company. Are there restrictions that might apply?
Right. Yeah, and it's just wild. Like when, I mean, we've worked together on a couple of clients, right? And to find out the things that are export controlled or do require filings are really intriguing. And quite frankly, right, they were required because we had some investors coming into some of those companies that this did create a situation, back to the strategic investment that we were discussing a little bit earlier, right? So I guess one of my final questions then, unless, don't be shy about putting those questions in the chat. One of my questions would be, um, what are some of the things like that you would say to someone if they're saying, hey, what if they're really pushing back on you and they say, I just don't want to do the filing? Is there anything there that you would strongly suggest, that if we haven't talked about it already, I guess I would say?
Well, certainly if the filing appears to be mandatory and they're saying they just don't want to do it, I would, I would, use all of my resources because the potential penalties are so high. And I've not yet met the person or company who says, you're right, we just won't do it.
Throw caution to the wind.
Usually what happens is companies, if they're really reluctant to do the filing, try to restructure. Or they try to do a kind of like a stage transaction where they're like, oh, great, wonderful foreign investor, you give us this money now, we'll give you a passive investment, and then we agree within like a year or two to do the filing, when the company has a little more resources. And then once it's cleared, you get, additional access,
Okay.
additional
Interesting.
roles. That's
Interesting.
one thing.
Okay. No, I mean, I get it, because cost is real, right? Like startups have to, take a lot of dollars and they spread them very, very thin to figure out how to make things be so. But naturally, whenever we have the government involved, generally speaking, they have a lot of resources. So it's best to comply to the
Yes.
greatest degree. So we do have a super interesting question that just popped up. And so it says, to make the fund's portfolio companies exempt from future divestiture and still so that they can still receive money from foreign state-owned investors, what is the general advice for fund managers to make sure the structure of the fund can fall into the safe harbor of CFIUS? That's a really great question.
Okay. So, Lindsay, do you think we're talking about structuring a fund so that it doesn't trigger CFIUS, or are we talking about the structuring the portfolio company?
So I think this one the question here is talking about foreign investors, so I would assume it's in the fund, only fund level. So yeah, let's start there.
Yeah. So, and we didn't really talk about funds too much. Funds have to answer this question almost like on the meta level, right? So, as we talked about, let's say you've got a US-based fund with foreign beneficial owners. So they sort of do the same analysis that we do in terms of, you know, do these fund investors have a seat on the, LPAC or something like the Limited Partner Advisory Committee?
Mhm.
What rights do they have to approve actions by the general partner or investments? Do they have access to technical information of the portfolio companies? So funds can do their own analysis and structure it so that foreign investors don't have those, and so their investment in the fund is what I'll call passive.
Mhm.
So, if you have a fund and it's like 80% owned by one foreign person, I'm not sure there's any amount of structuring you can do to make CFIUS that is truly passive, because there is a power to, having the money.
Sure.
Um, but yes, funds can structure their foreign LP investment so that it doesn't trigger CFIUS.
Great. And so, as a quick refresher, right, what are some of the things when maybe we have foreign investors of concern, and although they are not in control positions, they are truly in passive positions, but maybe they would be privy to some reporting information, as most fund investors are, from the portfolio companies. What do we have to think about there in terms of protecting that type of information?
Yes. So you would want to build in there both like requirements in the fund agreement and actual practice of not sharing technical information from the portfolio companies. You would want to be careful about like majority rules and like voting thresholds. That's actually where you spend a lot of time looking at it. So let's say the general partner's compensation requires a supermajority or something like that. And in order to make that supermajority, you really need these, like this foreign investors vote. That might be considered to give them enough like
Sure.
governance, right? So I think that's where you really want to be thinking. I've also seen many funds structure themselves where the general partner like has the right to amend the rights of the limited partners if necessary to, you know, uh, bring them out of CFIUS jurisdiction. So if,
Sure.
I've seen that quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess as we're starting to wrap up here, and before I give my final spiel, what did I not ask you that I should have asked you? And you're like, man, missed opportunity.
Well, I don't know if I expected you to ask this, but one thing I will say is we spend a lot of time trying to avoid CFIUS review, but most transactions are cleared. And, if you get yourselves organized, you go through it, sometimes it's really worth it to have the foreign investors be able to be involved in the way that they want and you want and to attract capital. And so it's not, you know, it is a process. It takes a little bit of time, gather a lot of info, but it's not like a deal killer either.
Sure.
Sometimes it is the wiser choice.
Exactly. And I will tell you, I mean, speaking from experience and working with you, Francesca, I mean, I've been on calls where you just plow through this information. I set aside an hour and a half for this call, and you're like 36 minutes done, So, I mean, you can move through it pretty quickly, and that's the benefit of being so experienced in it, right? But, if people are organized and you're able to motor through the information, it's not that time consuming sometimes, right? It can be done in a very clean and efficient way, which is why we tell all of our startups to make sure that they are not just flying by the seat of their pants. The more organized that we can be, the better, generally speaking. So trying to be respectful of everyone's time here. So naturally, Francesca, thanks so much for joining us on our inaugural Startups Streamlined session. I know this was super helpful for a lot of our startup clients and friends who are thinking about all of the things that you just talked about. So with that includes our discussion for today. This webinar was recorded and will be available to view in our library of recordings on our Thompson Hine YouTube channel. Next month, we're going to be featuring Megan Glowacki, a partner in our labor and employment practice group. And so if you have any questions regarding employees, contractors, what do we need to think about? Get those ready for next month. And so we want to thank all of you for attending today's program, and obviously a special thank you to you, Francesca, and the Thompson Hine marketing team for helping us to pull this together. And when this webinar ends, you'll be sent a survey requesting your feedback. 3 easy little questions. We kindly ask that you fill that out so we can make these better every single time. Not that we can ever top this one, Francesca, but you never know. We might get something. So with that, Francesca, thank you so much. And all of you out there, thanks for attending, and see you soon.